What if the story you were watching was never the real one? What if the silence everyone praised as maturity was actually doing something else entirely, protecting a narrative that didn't want to be questioned? This isn't about social media rumors. This isn't about internet speculation. And this definitely isn't about one moment caught out of context. According to Jaguar Wright, this situation didn't happen overnight. It unfolded quietly, behind controlled images, curated appearances, and intentional silence. Because when something is truly being hidden, it doesn't explode. It's managed. For years, Teyana Taylor has built a public image rooted in privacy, intention, and emotional discipline. But privacy doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means containment. Sometimes it means the cracks are forming where no one is allowed to look. And then there's Pierre, a name that didn't surface loudly, didn't surface randomly, and didn't surface without timing. Jaguar Wright didn't frame this as gossip. She framed it as pattern recognition. Who shows up when something ends quietly? Who becomes present when someone else becomes distant? And why do certain names only appear once the narrative is already shifting? Because according to what's being suggested, this wasn't about chemistry. It was about transition. It was about access. It was about who was positioned where and when. And the most uncomfortable part of this story isn't what was said. It's what no one rushed to deny. Because when silence lasts this long, it stops being confusion. It becomes strategy. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. There's a reason some stories never arrive loudly. They're designed not to. Public narratives don't collapse when something breaks. They collapse when something shifts, quietly, and no one is supposed to notice until it's already settled. For years, Teyana Taylor has been framed as intentional, calculated, grounded. Someone who doesn't move emotionally unless it's on her terms. That image wasn't accidental. It was built carefully, through silence, controlled access, and the refusal to over-explain. And in an industry where oversharing is currency, that restraint became power. But restraint can also become a shield, not just from the public, but from accountability. Because when you never address anything directly, you never have to correct the record. When you never have to confirm or deny, the audience fills in the blanks for you. And most of the time, they fill them in generously. Grace becomes assumption, silence becomes maturity, distance becomes strength, until the distance starts to look like something else. According to Jaguar Wright, the fracture didn't begin when names started circulating online. It began long before that, when alignment shifted behind closed doors, while the public image stayed exactly the same. That's the part people miss. Most relationships don't end in chaos. They end in quiet reorganization. Energy changes first, access changes next, and narratives follow last. Publicly, nothing looked different. No dramatic statements, no emotional interviews, no visible breakdowns. But behind the scenes, the structure was adjusting. Jaguar has always emphasized one thing when telling stories like this. Don't watch what people say. Watch what they stop doing. Who stops appearing together? Who stops speaking in specifics? Who starts moving independently while still benefiting from shared perception? Because separation doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just removes intention. And that's where the image starts working over time. The public version of Teyana remained controlled, graceful, and unaffected. That wasn't an act, but it wasn't the full picture either. According to the framing, silence wasn't just emotional discipline, it was narrative maintenance. And narrative maintenance is exhausting. Because once you commit to being unbothered, you don't get to react like a human anymore. You don't get to be confused publicly. You don't get to process in real time. Everything has to look resolved, even if nothing actually is. That pressure creates fractures that don't show up as tears. They show up as distance, as redirection, as timing that suddenly matters a lot more than it used to. This is where Pierre enters the conversation, not as a scandal, but as a marker. Names don't surface at random. They surface when narratives are already shifting. Jaguar didn't suggest this was about betrayal in the traditional sense. She framed it as overlap, emotional, temporal, strategic. The kind of overlap that doesn't require chaos to exist, just transition. And transitions are easiest when silence has already trained the audience not to ask questions. Think about it. If no one ever confirms what's happening, since no one can be accused of lying when something changes. If no one defines the ending, no one can challenge the beginning. That's how stories get rewritten without being corrected. And that's why public image matters so much in moments like this. Because image doesn't just protect reputation, it controls interpretation. The audience isn't reacting to facts, they're reacting to familiarity. They believe what fits the version of the person they already know. And when that version has been consistent for years, it becomes harder to question, even when the pieces don't fully align anymore. Jaguar Wright has always pointed out that this is where power quietly lives in the industry. Not in fame, not in money, but in narrative patience. Who can afford to wait? Who doesn't need to explain? Who knows that time will soften questions better than answers ever could? That's why this wasn't exposed with screenshots or shock value. It was exposed through observation, through pattern recognition, through noticing what no longer matched. Because when public image stays frozen while private behavior shifts, something has already broken. And the public doesn't notice the break immediately. They notice it when a new name feels unsurprising, not shocking, not outrageous, just oddly well-timed. That's when silence stops feeling like privacy and starts feeling like preparation. And once that realization settles in, the story stops being about rumors. It becomes about control. Jaguar Wright has never positioned herself as a messenger of shock. She doesn't rush to break news. She doesn't chase moments. She studies patterns. And that distinction matters, because patterns don't rely on screenshots. They don't depend on leaks. They don't need viral clips to survive. Patterns reveal themselves slowly, through repetition, timing, and behavior that stays consistent even when the faces change. According to Jaguar Wright, this situation wasn't about a sudden betrayal or a surprise connection. It was about how transitions inside the industry tend to happen when narratives are already being quietly adjusted. That's why she didn't frame this as scandal. She framed it as sequence. One phase ends, another phase overlaps, and the public only sees the middle, never the beginning. Jaguar has said repeatedly that the most revealing stories aren't loud. They're careful. They move in ways that look clean on the surface, but feel confusing if you look too closely. And confusion is often intentional, because confusion buys time. In this case, the confusion didn't come from conflicting statements. It came from the absence of them. No clarification, no firm boundaries, no clear definitions of when something ended or why. And when definitions disappear, interpretation becomes flexible. Jaguar has always pointed out that in high-profile relationships, endings aren't announced when emotions end. They're announced when positioning is complete, when access has already been rerouted, when the next chapter can exist without disrupting the current image. That's why timing matters more than confirmation. The appearance of Pierre in public conversation didn't arrive with explanation. It arrived with plausibility. And plausibility is powerful, because when something feels plausible, people don't interrogate it. They accept it. Jaguar suggested that this wasn't about replacement. It was about reassignment. Emotional energy doesn't vanish when a relationship quiets down. It moves. And it usually moves towards something that already feels aligned, already feels safe, already exists within proximity. This is where Jaguar's commentary becomes uncomfortable for people, because it challenges the idea that relationships end cleanly. According to her framing, they rarely do. They dissolve gradually, while the public is still reacting to an image that no longer reflects reality. And silence plays a critical role in that process. Silence keeps doors open. Silence prevents accountability. Silence allows multiple narratives to coexist without ever colliding. Jaguar didn't accuse anyone of deception outright. She described a structure, one that appears repeatedly in the industry, a structure where clarity is delayed long enough for outcomes to become normalized before questions are ever asked. By the time the public notices something has changed, the change has already been lived with privately. That's why outrage never fully lands. That's why denials aren't necessary. That's why nothing feels explosive, just strangely accepted. According to Jaguar, this is how reputations stay intact even when stories shift underneath them. Not by lying, but by not defining. When no one defines the moment of separation, no one can accuse anyone of overlap. When no one defines timelines, no one can challenge them. And when no one confirms or denies, every interpretation becomes optional. That optionality is power. And Jaguar has always argued that the industry rewards emotional discipline, not honesty. The person who reacts less, speaks less, explains less, is often treated as the more stable one. And stability becomes credibility, even when it's performative. In this framing, silence isn't emotional maturity. It's leverage. And leverage only works if the audience has been trained to respect quiet more than clarity. This is why Jaguar focuses less on who did what, and more on how the story was allowed to exist without interruption. Because uninterrupted narratives don't happen accidentally, they're protected. Protected by distance, protected by image, protected by the assumption that privacy equals integrity. But privacy can also hide transitions that people aren't ready to accept yet. Jaguar suggested that by the time names surface publicly, the emotional decisions have already been made, the attachment has already shifted, the separation has already occurred internally, even if it hasn't been acknowledged externally. And when that happens, the public is always late. They argue about beginnings that are already endings. They debate overlap that has already been resolved privately. They wait for statements that were never intended to come. This is why Jaguar's commentary often feels unsettling. She's not giving people something to react to. She's giving them something to notice. Notice who moves on without closure. Notice who benefits from ambiguity. Notice who never needs to clean up the narrative because it never gets messy in the first place. According to her framing, this wasn't a breakdown. It was a transition handled quietly enough to avoid resistance. And resistance is the only thing that threatens systems like this. Because once clarity is forced, positioning collapses. Once timelines are defined, accountability becomes unavoidable. And once accountability enters the conversation, silence stops working. That's why Jaguar doesn't rush stories. She lets them age. She waits for consistency. She waits to see if behavior contradicts image, or confirms it. And when confirmation keeps happening without explanation, she calls it what it is. Not chaos. Not coincidence. But design. By the end of her commentary, Jaguar wasn't asking people to pick sides. She was asking them to stop confusing quiet with innocence, to stop assuming that the absence of noise means the absence of intention. Because in environments where image is currency, the quietest moves are often the most deliberate. And once you recognize that, the story shifts again. It's no longer about what happened between specific people. It becomes about how narratives are protected long enough for outcomes to feel natural. And that's the pattern most people miss. Names don't enter stories by accident. They arrive when the ground is already prepared. That's the part most people misunderstand. When Pierre became part of the conversation, it didn't feel explosive. It felt plausible. And plausibility is not coincidence, it's timing. According to Jaguar Wright, timing tells you more than confirmation ever will, because confirmation can be denied. Timing can't. By the time a new name surfaces publicly, the emotional movement has usually already happened privately. People assume exposure creates change. In reality, change happens first. Exposure just catches up late. Jaguar didn't frame Aaron's presence as a sudden entrance. She framed it as a reveal of positioning. That distinction matters. Because when a relationship truly ends cleanly, there's usually space, time, a visible pause, a period where nothing new appears because nothing new exists yet. But when transitions overlap quietly, there is no pause, only redirection. And redirection doesn't announce itself. It shows up in proximity, in access, in who becomes present when someone else becomes unavailable. Jaguar has always emphasized that industry relationships don't operate on randomness. They operate on alignment, emotional alignment, professional alignment, lifestyle alignment. And alignment doesn't begin the moment the public notices it. It begins when two people find themselves in the same emotional temperature. That's why Aaron's name didn't shock people. It didn't contradict the narrative, it fit into it. And when something fits too easily, it's usually because it's been forming quietly for a while. Publicly, Teyana Taylor remained consistent, composed, controlled, unreactive. But according to the pattern Jaguar described, consistency can sometimes mask transition. The absence of chaos doesn't mean the absence of movement. It means movement is being managed. Jaguar suggested that this wasn't about emotional replacement, it was about emotional availability. When one dynamic becomes heavy, unresolved, or energetically closed, people naturally gravitate towards spaces that feel open. And openness doesn't require betrayal to exist. It only requires emotional distance elsewhere. This is where timelines become uncomfortable for people, because they want clean stories. They want clear endings, followed by clear beginnings. But Jaguar has consistently said that clarity is rare in environments where image matters more than truth. Instead, what you get are soft overlaps, conversations that start as support, presence that starts as professional, access that feels innocent until it isn't. And none of that requires public acknowledgement to be real. Jaguar didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. She questioned how quickly narratives adjusted without explanation. She questioned why no one felt the need to clarify anything, because clarification would force timelines into focus. And timelines are dangerous when you're relying on ambiguity. Think about it. If no one defines when something ended, then no one has to explain when something else began. Everything exists in a gray area where accountability can't land cleanly. That gray area is intentional. Jaguar has always said that the industry thrives on undefined endings because undefined endings keep options open. They protect reputations. They allow people to move without resistance. And resistance is the one thing silence prevents. Aaron's role in the story, according to this framing, wasn't as a disruptor. It was as an indicator, a signal that emotional realignment had already occurred. By the time the public noticed, the emotional work was already done. That's why there was no rush to deny, no urgency to explain, no visible discomfort, because discomfort happens when people are caught off guard. This didn't feel like that. Jaguar suggested that what people were reacting to wasn't betrayal, it was finality. The realization that something had already ended long before anyone was invited to witness it. And when endings happen privately, the public is always late to the truth. They debate timelines that no longer matter. They demand explanations that were never going to be given. They look for villains when the real story is structure. Structure protects people from having to explain emotional decisions. Structure allows silence to do the heavy lifting. Structure makes transitions feel natural instead of disruptive. This is why Jaguar keeps repeating the same warning. Don't confuse grace with transparency. Someone can move gracefully and still leave questions unanswered. And unanswered questions are not accidents. They are tools. Because as long as nothing is defined, everything remains defensible. Jaguar didn't ask people to believe her. She asked them to observe. Observe how quickly narratives adjust without resistance. Observe how new dynamics appear without denial. Observe how silence is respected instead of challenged. That respect is what allows systems like this to function. By the end of this part of the story, it becomes clear that Pierre's presence isn't the headline, it's the timestamp. It marks when the emotional shift became visible enough that the public could no longer ignore it. But visibility doesn't equal beginning. It equals confirmation. And confirmation, in this case, came without explanation, which tells you everything you need to know about how much explanation was ever intended. Because when positioning is complete, silence feels safe. And that's when the story enters its most dangerous phase. Silence is often mistaken for peace. But in situations like this, silence isn't peace, it's pressure. Pressure applied quietly, without fingerprints. By the time this story reached this phase, the public wasn't waiting for confirmation anymore. They were watching behavior. And behavior, unlike statements, doesn't need to be edited. No firm denials, no clear timelines, no emotional responses, just stillness. According to Jaguar Wright, this is not accidental. Silence becomes most useful after positioning is complete. Once emotional shifts have already happened, speaking only introduces risk. Because words can be challenged, silence cannot. Jaguar has always argued that silence isn't the absence of strategy, it is the strategy. Especially in environments where public reaction can create consequences that private decisions never would. At this stage, silence does three important things. First, it delays accountability. When nothing is clarified, no one can be accused of lying. When no timeline is confirmed, overlap can't be proven. The lack of definition creates a fog where responsibility never lands cleanly on anyone. Second, silence transfers the burden. The longer nothing is said, the more pressure shifts away from the people who made the decisions and onto the audience, and especially onto the person expected to respond gracefully. Grace becomes obligation. Strength becomes expectation. Composure becomes a trap. This is where Teyana Taylor sits in the narrative, not as someone avoiding accountability, but as someone carrying the weight of an image she built through discipline. When you're known for being private, any response feels like a violation of your own brand, and silence becomes the only move that doesn't contradict who people think you are. But that silence comes at a cost, because the longer you don't speak, the more people decide the story for you. They interpret quiet as consent. They assume acceptance. They believe everything must be resolved, because if it wasn't, surely someone would say something. That assumption protects everyone except the person living inside the unresolved reality. Jaguar has pointed out that silence doesn't always mean comfort. Sometimes it means calculation. Sometimes it means survival. And sometimes it means choosing the least damaging option in a situation where every option costs something. The third function of silence is normalization. Time does what statements cannot. It softens outrage. It reframes shock into familiarity. What once felt confusing slowly starts to feel inevitable. People stop asking, "What happened?" They start saying, "This makes sense now." And when that happens, the story locks into place without ever being confirmed. This is why Jaguar warns people not to confuse dignity with closure. Someone can move forward without ever receiving clarity. Someone can appear settled while still carrying unanswered questions. Silence allows that contradiction to exist, but silence also creates erosion. Internally, it forces the person staying quiet to carry every interpretation alone. Every narrative that circulates without correction becomes something they have to absorb without responding to. Externally, it creates distance between perception and reality. Because when silence lasts long enough, people stop believing there's anything left to say. Jaguar suggested that this is the most dangerous phase, not because of exposure, but because of exhaustion. Silence relies on the assumption that eventually, the emotional weight will feel heavier than the desire for clarity. And when exhaustion sets in, people choose peace over truth. But peace built on silence isn't peace, it's postponement. This is why Jaguar emphasizes watching who benefits from quiet. Silence rarely protects everyone equally. It protects positioning. It protects reputation. It protects optionality. And it often leaves the emotional cost unpaid. By now, the story is no longer about who did what. It's about who is expected to carry the consequences quietly, who is expected to stay composed, who is expected to move on without explanation, who is expected to protect the image even if the image no longer protects them. Jaguar doesn't push people to speak. She understands the cost of clarity. Once something is said, it can't be unsaid. Once a narrative is defined, it can't be managed quietly anymore. Clarity forces endings, and endings disrupt systems that thrive on ambiguity. That's why silence lasts as long as it does. Not because there's nothing to say, but because saying it would change everything. By the end of this phase, silence stops feeling like control and starts feeling like confinement. The same quiet that once protected the narrative begins to suffocate it. And that's when decisions have to be made. Not publicly, privately, because eventually silence stops working. And when it does, the story doesn't explode. It resolves. This is where the story ends, not with confirmation, not with denial, and not with a viral explosion. It ends with a choice. Because by now, the pattern is clear. Not chaos, not coincidence, but control through silence. According to the way Jaguar Wright framed it, this was never about scandal. It was about timing, about positioning, about how narratives are protected long enough for outcomes to feel natural instead of questioned. Nothing here has been rushed to be denied. Nothing has been clearly defined. And that silence has done exactly what it was supposed to do. It gave the story time to settle. But silence doesn't erase questions. It just postpones them. Because when no one explains, people stop waiting for answers and start watching behavior. So, who moves forward without closure? Who never has to clarify? And who is expected to carry the weight of being graceful, no matter the cost? This isn't about villains and victims. It's about power and who pays for quiet. Was this a coincidence or a calculated transition? Was silence maturity or strategy? And when clarity is delayed long enough, does it even matter anymore? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think this was intentional or just the natural ending of something that had already been over? Share this before it disappears into the timeline, because the truth doesn't always come out in statements. Sometimes it reveals itself in what never gets said. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it.